Okay, I think we'll make a start, as I'm conscious of time, and I'm sure more participants will be filing in, so we can lose the holding slide if we can, please, and we'll make a start. Excellent. So welcome along, everyone. My name is Ben Harrison. I'm the director of the Work Foundation. We're a policy unit at Lancaster University Management School. For those of you who don't know us, the Work Foundation has a long and storied history stretching all the way back to 1918 and the formation of the Industrial Society. And really throughout the past century and a bit, our mission has remained broadly consistent in that we are here to help support everyone access good and rewarding and secure work, and to help organisations make the most of their workforce. And really in that context, we've been really focused over the course of the last 18 months and through the COVID-19 pandemic in trying to understand, together with colleagues across Lancaster University, the ways in which the world of work is changing. And one of those most prominent ways in which I think, so many of us have experienced changes in the way in which we work over the course of that time has been this shift to remote and hybrid working, initially in response to some of the safety precautions that we all needed to take, but increasingly as the sort of crisis has continued, bigger questions have been raised around, well, to what extent is this a new normal for many organisations and for many workers. Today's event really is an opportunity to explore some of those questions. It's part of a long-running series that the Lancaster University Management School has been running on a range of topics, really trying to hone in on those issues that are of the utmost importance to employers as we reach the end of 2021 and think ahead to 2022. To help us talk today about hybrid working and the rise of flexible models of work and the extent to which we expect to see them endure as hopefully we continue to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm really pleased to be joined by Heather Taylor from the Work Foundation, who has led on so much of our analysis in this space over the last 6 to 12 months. And she will shortly kick us off with an overview of what our research has been revealing over the course of that period. And then we're also going to hear from a fantastic panel of speakers as well. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Steve Butler, the Chief Executive of Punter Southall Aspire, Laura Pachis, who's a lecturer in organisational studies at the Management School, and Daisy Hooper, the Head of Policy and Public Affairs at the Chartered Management Institute, with whom we've conducted quite a bit of research this year into this very topic. Two very quick final bits of meeting admin before we start. You may have had an alert on your screen. We are recording the conversation this afternoon, and we'll be able to share that after the event. If you would like to ask a question of panelists today, I'll start taking those questions after we've heard from each panelist individually. Please submit them through the questions function in Zoom. I'll be keeping a track of that. You can upvote questions that others contribute that you would particularly like to see answered, and I will put them to our panelists as we go through the event. But to get us going, I'll now hand over to Heather. She has a few slides to take us through. You may still be on mute, Heather, just in case you.
That just took a little bit longer than I thought there to get that shared. Thanks very much for that, Ben. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other panelists as well. So as Ben just indicated there, at the Work Foundation, we've recently completed 3 different research projects exploring the future of remote and hybrid working. And I'm going to talk through broadly some of the findings and recommendations from those today. So the first of those was looking into the impacts and prospects for remote and hybrid working in the north of England. Secondly, it was making hybrid more inclusive, and that was the research that we did in partnership with Daisy and others at the CMI. And finally, we looked into the experiences of remote and hybrid internships during the pandemic. So as we know, the pandemic has, oh, has that moved on? Slides? No? Yeah, sorry. So as we know, the pandemic has driven a surge in remote working, with only 6% of people working remotely prior to the pandemic in January and February 2020. And by March 2021, this had increased to 29% of workers across the UK. There's a widespread misconception that remote working could only be done at any scale in the south of England, but our research has also found substantial take-up in the northwest and northeast. Similarly, while some internships and placements were cancelled at the onset of the pandemic, the last 18 months have seen many continue remotely throughout, with employers creating opportunities for interns to work on new and interesting projects that can be carried out remotely or at least partially remotely. It's perhaps unsurprising then that the pandemic has prompted a lasting shift to remote and hybrid work in many organisations. Close to 9 in 10 workers that we surveyed told us that they don't want to return to pre-COVID working patterns. Although, as you can see in this graph here, there's substantial variation in what people do want to do going forward. Hybrid is the preferred approach. So on average, workers want to work for remotely for about 3 out of 5 days if they're full-time. But employers and organisations might be interpreting this slightly differently. So 46% of managers told us that they expect an organisationally hybrid model. And by that they mean some workers fully remote and some fully on-site. And 38% told us that they expect staff to work in an individually hybrid way. So in other words, a mixture of on-site and remote work across their working week. Furthermore, the changes prompted by the pandemic have led to employers exploring increasing access to other forms of flexible working beyond just remote working. So this could be compressed hours, job sharing, part-time, and there's lots of other forms of flexible work too. This is really important, that the design of hybrid working models goes hand in hand with other types of flexible working. And from an inclusivity point of view, this can help the entry, retention, well-being and progression of various groups of staff, particularly disabled staff and people with caring responsibilities. So now is the time to look at the ways of making your organisation more inclusive, adapting what has worked for people and changing what hasn't. Nevertheless, traditional views of the workplace do still stand in some organisations. Managers that we surveyed say that hybrid working could limit access to workplace opportunities, such as stretch projects and workplace networks for specific worker groups, including young people, parents, and those with caring responsibilities, which often fall on women. We also recently heard Chancellor Rishi Sunak saying that working from home is not nearly as valuable for young people's careers as going into the office. But it would be wrong to suggest that the pre-pandemic workplace was free from inequality and worked well for everyone. Managers now need to take account of the new reality that employers want and need to work in more flexible ways. They need to support it and ensure that remote workers are not disadvantaged in their organisation. So how can they do that? Firstly, consultation. So organisations should consult with staff on their broader preferences for flexible work, taking into account the importance of flexibility, not only in where employees work, but how and when they work. There is a compelling case to do so that we surfaced in our research. We found that employees in organisations that have carried out consultations on remote working policies are more likely to be happy with their own remote working arrangements. And they're also more likely to say that decisions about who can and cannot work remotely in the organisation are made fairly. Consultation should be a continuous process with staff. So this could include regular information and feedback sessions and holding open dialogue with employees around key issues such as disconnecting from work and how in-person time in the workplace is best used. In terms of communication, this should be an absolute priority for managers and leaders, although communication tools should be used predominantly for checking in and offering support rather than excessively monitoring staff that are working from home or wherever remotely. Furthermore, a deliberate approach needs to be taken to knowledge sharing. So this means carefully planning, onboarding and training sessions, and encouraging the development of informal networks such as buddy systems, mentoring schemes, BAME networks and the like. Ultimately, to make this work, organisations need to foster an open and supportive culture and should not underestimate the power of role modelling behaviours. Our research shows that where managers and leaders are supportive of remote working and work in this way themselves, workers are significantly more comfortable in requesting to do so. Additionally, increasing the take-up of flexibility amongst men should be prioritised. This would help absorb flexibility into the working culture and reduce misconceptions and the associated career penalties, and could achieve important progress towards equality at work. We know that flexibility is valued across all different worker groups. And for example, the men that we surveyed were just as likely as women to want to work remotely at least some of the time. So to make all of this happen, managers need to be adequately trained and prepared to manage hybrid teams, with a focus on building capacity to support the performance and well-being of their workers. So that's all from me just now. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Heather. That's a really helpful framing and a sort of highlighting really of some of the key issues which I think the reality is organisations and managers and workers are all directly working through right now, and certainly all of the employers we speak to, the vast majority of them are running pilots or are thinking about what the right model for them really is, and trying to do that in a consultative way as you reflect on there. I'm going to turn now to Steve to perhaps reflect on some of the things that you've heard there from Heather, but also to give his particular perspective as a senior executive in a major organisation, as well as someone who has considered these issues in the round. Steve, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you. I thought what I'd do is just kind of walk through my experience over the last kind of year by way of a case study. So we're a business, we're 150 people. Pre-COVID, we had 9 offices across the UK. And historically, we had a culture where it was kind of okay to work from home occasionally. You know, if you're having your boiler fixed, you didn't want to have to take the day off, or if there was a school assembly, you didn't want to have to kind of rush back into the office. And about 50% of the business had client-facing roles, so they were kind of in and out of the office. But the challenge that I had was that some of my managers just didn't trust their employees working from home. So we never achieved a fully flexible arrangement pre-COVID. COVID obviously happened. As a regulated business, we were very resilient. Everyone had laptops, headsets, Microsoft Teams, and we transitioned to home working overnight. And as a business, we functioned well over the COVID period, working from home. This year, we've started to think about, well, what does the future look like? And I've very intentionally looked at the future through a diversity inclusion lens. I thought this was an opportunity to increase the inclusive culture of the business and use it as a step forward rather than returning to perhaps old ways of doing things. So the first thing I did was in the spring of this year, I implemented manager networks where I got my managers together on a monthly basis, where we talked about best practice, about how we were going to manage some of the issues. You know, what were the skills that my managers needed to manage mixed teams of people in the office and people at home? What skill sets did they need to kind of deal with all the issues that were going to arise? We had conversations around, how are we going to deal with employees that perhaps were at home more than others and were perhaps suffering from isolation? How were we going to deal with career progression if people perhaps didn't have the profile that they might have had if they were in the office 5 days a week? How are we going to deal with employee recognition? How are we going to make sure that our kind of graduates got the office experience and kind of training that we required? So through the spring of last year, we kind of equipped the managers with the tools that they would need to kind of move forward. In the summer, I then offered the whole business the option to move to a flexible working contract. And very intentionally, we made this move reason neutral. I think if you have to say you're doing it for childcare reasons or for carer reasons or whatever, it kind of impacts the manager's view. Whereas if it's reason neutral, everyone is having it, you know, it suits everyone. And clearly disabled workers, you know, might want more time at home and less time in the office. Younger employees that are kind of still learning want more time in the office. So although we suggested a kind of 3-2 working arrangement, I left it for the managers to work out what was best for the individuals in their team and for the team themselves, because we didn't want a kind of burden on the team because one person was in a certain location or not. And at the same time, we offered people compressed working weeks, part-time working, etc., so that we had a fully flexible kind of organisation going forward. I felt it was quite important for myself as CEO to kind of champion that flexibility. So in the summer, in a company presentation, I set the vision that I wanted 100% of employees to have some sort of flexible working contract by the end of this year. And it was an ambition of the business, not something that we would have to do if people asked. From a practical perspective, we then had to do analysis on our offices, because if people were only going to be in for 2 days a week, some of our small regional offices would have much lower occupancy, and we'd find that people might be in the office on their own. As a result, we closed our Southampton office, Exeter office, Bristol and York offices, and those individuals, we put arrangements where they would work from home but come to a regional administration hub at least once during the week. And as teams, they would often book a meeting room once a month where they might have their team meeting, but continue working in that room for the rest of the day so they could spend more time with their colleagues. Obviously, from an HR perspective, people working from home, we had to do risk assessments to make sure that their home working environment was appropriate. We were able to redistribute kit, you know, monitors, chairs, etc., from the offices that were closed to people's homes, so that they had a permanent working environment that worked. That did create some difficult conversations, because, you know, I had employees that during COVID were working at the shed at the end of the garden with no central heating, and I couldn't allow them to continue to work on that basis. So they either had to kind of change their arrangement or kind of spend more time in the office, which, you know, as I say, was some difficult conversations. Throughout the COVID period, we implemented a mental health program. So we had a monthly program where we looked at different mental health issues. That worked really well, and we're continuing to run that now into the future as a permanent part of kind of what we do. Our London office, which was our largest office, we're actually in the process of refurbing at the moment. So we're cutting down to a third of the desks that we previously had on a hot desking arrangement, but with an app where people can book the desks in advance and know where they're going to sit. They can see who else is sat at the desks and who they want to sit to or not. And the rest of the space is being made into a open plan business lounge style. So people can drop in for periods of the day. People can come in for the sole purpose to have a coffee with a colleague, rather than feeling obliged to come in for the whole day and sit at a desk. The other thing I've made, and I don't know whether this is the right decision or not, but I've made the decision that we won't have hybrid meetings, because I believe they're exclusive to those that are not in the room. So we're either going to be on Teams from home, or we will all be in the office together. We're not going to allow blended meetings. And as that feels right to me, but I don't know whether that's where we'll end up. We had a reverse mentoring scheme within the business where the senior managers were mentored by junior staff. And that has really helped raise the profile of the junior staff with the senior managers. So we've now rolled out our reverse mentoring across all managers. So almost a third of the business are involved in a reverse mentoring arrangement, which I think really helps the more junior staff coming into the organisation to, one, get profile, and two, although it's learn from their senior colleagues, although they might not always be in the office with them. So that's kind of the journey that we've been on. I'll just finish up by saying it's an experiment. So we've agreed to sit down in the summer of next year and review what's worked and hasn't worked to make adjustments to it. And I have a sense that we'll be doing that for a number of years to come until we get the formula right.
Thank you very much, Steve. I mean, it's fascinating to hear the ways in which you are sort of proactively sort of taking that program forward. Certainly a theme that has come from the range of projects that Heather described from our side has been the sense that actually it's so important that organizations do exactly that they look at this strategically and sort of engage with it proactively, because if you're just going to wait to see what individuals want, then you could end up with a much messier system, and actually one which sort of ends up taking steps backwards in terms of diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, and I imagine, like lots of organisations, I've actually had a higher turnover in the last year than I've ever experienced in the last 10 years. So one, I've got to make the business attractive for future employees, and two, COVID means that I can now work geographically across anywhere in the UK. So I'm now accessing a much wider talent pool if I can offer people the flexibility of where they work, which from a diversity perspective can only be a good thing for the business. Yes,
yeah. I have many more questions for you, as I'm sure other people do as well, but I'm going to hold my fire until we've heard from other panelists. Just a reminder to everybody participating in the webinar, I can see questions are coming in, which is fantastic. Use the question and answer function if you'd like to ask one, and even if you don't have a question of your own, you can upvote questions by clicking on the thumbs up, which will put that question to the top of the list, and it'll make it more likely that we get through it. I'm going to hand over now to Laura Pachis, who is a lecturer in the Organisation and Work department at Lancaster University Management School. And she's going to talk us through her take on these issues and reference some of the research that she's been engaged in. Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, everyone. So I want to share a piece of research that I've been doing, that I've done in pre-pandemic times, but I think this kind of informs and talks to what Heather and Steve have been focusing on in relation to how we use also the tools that are involved into hybrid work. So what we were interested at the time was understanding work-life balance, and understanding it from the point of view of how work-life balance is managed through the use of technology. So when we started looking into this topic, we found that on one side, of course, mobile devices like smartphone, tablets, and wearables can facilitate the management of the work-life boundary, but at the same time, they created some conflicts. In particular, what we noticed is that it is about the practices, the use that we make of these devices that will affect our work-life balance. So you can imagine different styles of how people use these devices. So I'm thinking of those that want to keep work away from their private lives. So they will have a more segmented type of approach to their management of work-life balance. For example, they might have a work phone and a personal phone, where they separate the emails that come in on one device and the calls that come in on one device versus the other. On the other side, you can have those that like this integration, and they like to use technologies to integrate these different domains of their lives. So at the time, we wanted to understand what use is made of these devices, how that impacts work-life balance and the well-being of workers. So what we did, we focused on 3 different phases of the research. In the first phase, we explored the impact of these devices on productivity, employees' productivity. Through surveys. The second phase, right, when we had kind of an overview of how people use these devices, we wanted to understand how does this use impact work-life balance. So we kind of took a more qualitative approach to it. And to conclude, we wanted to see the implications of these technologies across different work and non-work settings. I'm thinking about when we travel, commute, now probably not a relevant aspect of our lives any longer, but we might use downtimes, or we might use what used to be a commuting time to do work-related tasks by using these devices. So what we found when thinking about how people use devices to manage their work, they express concerns around how these devices can interrupt our workflow, but in a negative way impact productivity. Thinking about, I'm putting here an example of an analyst who told us that, well, I was sitting with a client and we were going through a mapping process, and then my other colleague tries to reach me through my phone, and that kind of disrupts what she was doing to the point that leads her to zoning out. So these information overload that comes through the mixture of being present at work, but also using devices for work, creates a struggle in those that have to manage these devices and the work tasks that they are currently doing. At the same time, though, we found that the continuation of work activities, for example, as I was mentioning, the commuting times or when traveling, also for personal reasons or for work reasons. So now that traveling for work starts picking up again, during these, let's call them downtimes, mobile devices can bring some productivity benefits. Again, bearing in mind that the information overload. So imagine yourself trying to reach the train station and at the same time receiving a call from a colleague that is very important for the meeting you're going to. So when focusing in, though, on the work-life boundary, what we found is that through these devices, work naturally leaks into home. And what it was very important for the people that we talked to was that they fear that there was some sort of negative impressions from switching off, and the difficulty of navigating these fears. So whilst in pre-pandemic time, flexible work to them allowed a better work-life balance, at the same time, it was the management of their absence and the switching off that was problematic to them. And that might also be related to, as Stephen had highlighted, to a generational dimension where younger generations might feel more the work pressure when joining, for example, as new colleagues, and the pressures that might feel from managers to be present, to be continuously connected. So what we also found was that work intensification led to increased engagement and at the same time increased the concerns and anxiety. In a way, what we found was kind of a productivity puzzle or a vicious cycle in which work in a way was enhanced by the use of these devices during downtimes, but that also meant more work information flowing in, kind of an information overflow, and then users feeling locked in a situation where they try to carry out work, but at the same time they feel distracted and they feel the pressure of responding to other work demands. So what we have learned from these projects is that well-being impacts of managing work remotely are linked to the engagement that we have with mobile devices and the practices at work. So these fear of unplugging and the repercussions that these fears have on the well-being of the employees, but also the repercussions that they might have at work matter, and they matter for these employees. So as Heather has highlighted, work culture matters, and the way we create an inclusive culture matters. Connectivity also brings a feeling of staying on top of things. So it might have some positive aspects related to it, but it makes the work-life boundary thinner, and it might impact negatively the way we manage a healthy work-life boundary. So there is a price also as well for the cognitive effort of switching in between being on and off mobile devices, and that comes with stress and potential personal conflicts of going back to work activities while, for example, we are already off in a way at home with our families. So this is a kind of a more open question for this webinar. We need to start thinking about how what workplaces can do to mitigate these forms of stress. And this was a very important point that came across our research. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. And as you say, I mean, these were sort of big challenges pre-pandemic. And that was, in a sense before, we'd sort of seen this rationing up of hybrid work, and a big sort of feature of the research that Heather and Daisy have been leading on together. You hear coming back from participants in that this sort of blending of home and work life and a sort of fear of not being able to disconnect has been a big concern, and it sort of had an impact on well-being. So definitely want to pick that back up in the wider conversation. Before we get there, I'm going to hand over to Daisy now from the Chartered Management Institute. As we've already mentioned a couple of times, we've been working with Daisy and colleagues at the CMI on a big bulk of the research we've done in this space. And Daisy will take us through now her reflections from engaging in their membership and other elements of research that you've undertaken, Daisy.
Thanks, Ben, and hi everybody. Thanks for having me today. It's been great to work on this project with the Work Foundation, as others have highlighted, and there's been some chat in the Q&A box I can see. Managers, and particularly line managers, are really critical to making hybrid working work. And a lot of them and a lot of organizations are not well prepared in how they manage those kinds of requests, in how they manage the day-to-day practicalities, and how they make sure that diversity and inclusion doesn't fall off the agenda when some of your workforce is working from home. So I think this project was really, really helpful, and there's some practical points in there that Heather pulled out. I was going to just reflect for a moment on the kind of policy argument. So we're the professional body for managers and leaders. We do a lot of, we develop a lot of practical resources for managers to support best practice. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of chat about that. But this is particularly topical right now from a government public policy perspective, because the government are consulting on their policies towards flexible working. And I think that from a policy perspective, hybrid is a little bit of a red herring, because really what we should be talking about is flexibility, and flexibility looks different to different people in different places and in different roles and in different sectors. And I think everyone recognizes that there's probably not a one size fits all, not least because more than half of the population can't do their job from home. But I think that's just important to bear in mind. And a lot of the things that Steve was talking about implementing in his organization were perhaps prompted by a move to remote working, but the processes for dealing with those requests and supporting managers and supporting employees can equally be applied to different kinds of flexibility. There has been a bit of mixed messaging from government over whether they want to see continued remote working and to what extent they want to see remote working. And part of that has been driven by some of the things that Steve identified, like are certain groups going to miss out, particularly young people, in terms of their development opportunities. I don't think that's a reason not to champion flexible working. Lots of young people want flexibility as well. It doesn't mean that they should miss out on learning and development opportunities, and there's an onus on organizations and managers to make sure that they don't miss out on those opportunities, as much as an onus on where those people work and where their employer wants them to work from. So the government is primarily concerned with how we change the culture around flexible working. So how do we make it a given that all employers can support some kind of flexibility to enable individual workers to have a better work-life balance, or do other things in their life alongside their job, like carrying responsibilities, or just if they want to go to their kids' school open day, as Steve referenced. And I think that's where the really interesting debate is, right? Like, how do you change the culture Some people just get it. Maybe it's because they had flexibility from their employer, because they need it, or it's just what they're used to. Lots of managers are worried about it. They don't know how to manage people working remotely. They are concerned about giving them those development opportunities. And in some cases, that's resulted in this kind of presenteeism culture, which we obviously don't think is a good thing. And lots of research suggests that that's not the way to get the best out of your people. So I'd be really interested to hear others' thoughts on what you think would change that culture. And at the moment, certainly related to this consultation, which you can respond to before the 1st of December if you are so inclined, is a debate around whether organizations should be forced to advertise jobs as flexible in their job adverts, or whether individuals should have the right to request flexible working from their first day in the job. And I think it's worth saying that although we have had a big move towards remote working for lots of people, the proportion of jobs that are advertised as flexible in adverts is still only about 1 in 4. And I am skeptical as to how much we can change working cultures if we don't encourage employers to think about the job design and think about how all jobs can be flexed in some way. Some will lend themselves much more naturally to remote working and others won't. But yeah, what's going to shift that dial? Because actually the uptake of flexible working has remained pretty consistent over the years. And the government introduced the right to request flexible working in 2003. So I think I'll stop there, Ben, but really looking forward to discussing with the other panelists and welcome your views.
Fantastic, thank you, Daisy. Let's start taking some questions, because we've had a good number, as each of you have sort of provided some introductory reflections. And I think one word which kind of comes through over and over again in a number of questions is this issue of trust. And this idea that a kind of shift into a more flexible or hybrid working model really demands more trust between colleagues, between managers and those that they manage, between leaders in the organisation and different teams and departments across an organisation. Steve, I might turn to you first, if that's all right, given the sort of experiences you've described. Do you maybe just offer your reflections on how you've sort of observed trust across your organisation and how you've tried to encourage greater levels of it?
Yeah, I think there was a trust issue pre-COVID, but as we went to lockdown and everyone people were working what would have been their commuting time, their productivity went up, and that trust issue that managers had, I think, kind of melted away because they found that they didn't need to worry about it. However, I think it's still something that we need to foster, and trust is really about kind of putting yourself in other people's shoes and understanding them better and having more empathy. So we, for a number of years now, in all our kind of project meetings and committee meetings, start with a sign-in where we go around the table and we all score our personal life and our well-being out of 10 and share some stories. And we start our meetings with a personal connection with one another. And that just builds trust, because the more you know about your team and your team members and what's going on in their life, if they're suddenly not available, but you know that they've got, a sick child, then it's fine. The trust issue is when you don't know what's going on.
Yeah,
I think the more you can embed storytelling and sharing in meetings, in interactions, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. Daisy, in terms of sort of your engagement with sort of managers across lots of different organisations, is trust an issue that you see coming up?
Yeah, it's a really big one. We did some research in 2020 during the pandemic looking at productivity, and we found a correlation between trust and productivity. So managers were much more likely to say that their staff were productive if they also said that they trusted their staff. And I think it's one of those slightly intangible things, but what we find is certainly the stuff that Steve mentioned. So building empathy, modeling good behavior, positive behavior, talking about well-being, creating that safe space is a really important way to build trust. And there are lots of tools that people can use. There's some debate around whether you can teach empathy, but you can certainly teach people to ask open questions, take a coaching approach, as I think someone mentioned in the Q&A. Those are really, really important for getting the most out of your staff and building that culture of trust.
Yeah. And I suppose another element of that sort of question around trust is I suppose trust that the organisation as a whole is committed and sort of is sort of going to kind of deliver on its sort of promises around flexibility and diversity and inclusion, and it's part of a broader shift essentially, rather than something which just one manager is having to kind of deal with in isolation. And I suppose what struck me as you were both reflecting there is, some of the stuff, Heather, that you were reflecting on in our research around some of those kind of legacy attitudes around hybrid working and overcoming some of that managers were expressing essentially that they weren't sure whether they necessarily believed you would be able to get promoted or you would be able to develop in your career if you were working in a more flexible or remote way.
Absolutely, we did see that, yeah.
And so through the research, were there particular things that came up that sort of might help combat some of those legacy attitudes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think obviously we spoke to some we surveyed some managers that said that way, but equally there were some managers responding in the survey who totally didn't believe that to be the case. In some of the open-ended responses, we asked for input on things like that. Actually, one of the things that came up, which was interesting, that Steve talked about in his organisation, was this idea of reverse mentoring. There were quite a few respondents who talked about that. So I think exploring that more and how that would work in different types of organisations and different sectors could be one way.
We've actually had a question specifically about reverse mentoring and requesting, Steve, that you maybe just explain a little bit more about what that is and how you've sort of deployed it within your organisation.
Yeah, I implemented it a year or so ago. As a business, we're in the investment and savings industry, which is very white male dominated. And my business has grown through acquisition. So my senior management team is very white male. And there's a danger of groupthink across the group of senior managers. So in trying to manage that risk, we implemented reverse mentoring. So I personally am reverse mentored by someone in my Oxford office. I'm based in London. They're 27. It's a woman who's Polish and is in a relatively junior role. So we meet monthly, and for the first couple of months, we just shared stories with one another. We didn't get into any business stuff. We just learned about each other and built trust. And now I share with her some of the challenges that I'm facing, and she just gives me a different perspective. And we laugh about some of the issues. She has some very genuine observations which are useful. She also has some very good observations about what's going on in the business and things that I just can't see because of kind of where I'm at. So a fantastic experience that I'd recommend to everyone. We kicked it off with a training session. So I think there's 16 of us in the initial kind of pilot. We had a training session about how we were going to work together. And we caught up again about 6 months after we launched it to share stories. And there was a positive experience by everyone in the group. On both sides, because the mentors themselves were being exposed to management challenges or leadership issues they'd never even thought about. It was really empowering for them to be involved in those conversations.
And exactly the kind of activity and the kind of conversation, because of the two-way nature of it, and actually the inversion of some of those more traditional kinds of conversations you would expect that can build trust, because managers and leaders are in a sense kind of giving more and being a bit more vulnerable in those kinds of conversations than they might normally be, I suppose.
Absolutely, because you have to have this agreement that nothing leaves the room between the conversation, and I think when we talk about not being present in the office and the experience of younger employees, this is a real opportunity for younger employees to have an exposure to what's going on in the rest of the business and learn in a way that they can't if they're just sat at home, which is why we've broadened it out for all line managers in the business, because it just covers a larger group of people.
Yeah. Just moving on to one of your other reflections earlier, Steve, around trust, which was sort of the idea that managers had sort of noticed that uptick in productivity. And I just wondered, Laura, whether when you heard Steve reflect on that people were sort of on their devices when they would normally be commuting, whether that gave you a sort of pang of worry, perhaps, given the research that you'd sort of undertaken.
It's absolutely a welcome finding, I would say, mostly because, well, the time that we might have used commuting to start connecting with work, it's now done probably in a much nicer atmosphere, thinking about overcrowded trains and modes of transport. So definitely a welcomed, and the more we experiment with these type of hybrid forms, the more we will start trusting that these actually work. So definitely a good sign for productivity measures.
So a sense then that probably some of that was happening anyway, but actually better for it to be a bit more structured and in a kind of a working environment rather than while you're doing 10 other things. Yes,
exactly. It might also reduce the kind of information overload that we might experience. So try to juggle many things at the same time while we are commuting, going to work, thinking about our personal things, and then but kind of fitting in work because we want to start the workday early and be prepared to be in the office with a kind of a clean agenda for the day. So yes.
Yeah. Another question that's sort of top of the charts, as it were, at the moment in the Q&A panel is around the kinds of barriers that are being expressed now, I think, is sort of the sort of particular emphasis, given the shift that we have seen, and we've obviously lots of organisations have moved large chunks of their workforce to work remotely for periods of time over the last 6 to 12 months. Daisy, are there particular things that sort of you've seen from your sort of membership of managers that sort of are recurring themes that managers sort of are sort of raising as concerns essentially in their workplace?
As concerns related to hybrid working?
Yes, and being able to sort of support colleagues in sort of adopting more flexibility.
Yeah, so it is quite a lot of the things that we've mentioned. So getting the balance right in terms of communication, making sure that they provide opportunities to people regardless of where they're working, being consistent in those kinds of opportunities, that's a challenge. Some very practical things like making hybrid meetings work. So I'm really interested that Steve's totally said no to hybrid meetings, because we do have hybrid meetings at CMI, partly because we have 2 locations. So the majority of our workers are based in Corby in Northamptonshire, and there's a smaller office in London. So we did that quite a bit before COVID, but I think would agree, and others have said the same in our surveys, that it doesn't always work well. You have to work really hard to make sure that you're not having conversations in the margins of those meetings, or you don't make a really important decision as you're wandering from that meeting back to your desk. And I think that is a really big challenge. I also think around this point about development opportunities, so whether they be for young people or other people who would choose for whatever reason to work the majority of their time away from the office, the onus has to be partly on the manager to make sure those opportunities are consistent, but we also need to do more, particularly for younger people, to give them the skills to be visible, to say yes to some of these opportunities in an environment where they won't necessarily be face to face. And I think there's a role for that in the education system, which is slightly tangential to this conversation, but assuming that there's increased remote working as technology becomes more and more embedded, it's an important skill that people will need, and one that we're not seeing, certainly younger people in the workforce, being particularly good at.
Yeah, the point around hybrid meetings in particular. I mean, in my last job, I was working in an organisation that had 5 or 6 offices across the country. I was based in the London office, and it was a perennial challenge that meetings that were sort of primarily held in London but had others kind of dialing into it were just really badly run, and people ended up feeling on the outside of those conversations, and it was a real cultural issue for the organisation, and that was why we were all in an office, but it wasn't, we weren't all in the same place. And I think you're right that it's a very different skill set required to kind of run those sessions versus a kind of regular meeting that will need to be addressed. Steve, in making that switch, has that been a positive thing? Have you found there are trade-offs involved in that which you're sort of still having to kind of grapple with?
In the hybrid meeting?
Yeah,
I mean, we've all learned over the last 18 months how to manage a video meeting. We've all become very good at turn taking and putting our hands up. So the productivity and quality of our meetings in Teams, from that perspective, is so much better. But what we do miss are those side conversations, those extra conversations that happen around the meeting. So how do we get the both of both worlds? And I'm yet to be convinced about blending the two. There's been conversations about, well, how can we have private meetings in an open plan space? And I'm saying, well, do your private meetings when you're at home, and the stuff that requires more rolling thought, collaboration or whatever, do those in the office, and have that as your reason to come into the office. Because I think at the moment, no one wants to come in the office to sit and do email all day. If you're going to come into the office, you need a reason for it. So, make those collaboration meetings the reasons to come in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned you've made a host of physical changes as well to try and, I guess, incentivize and encourage more collaborative time when colleagues are together in the office.
Slightly commercial, because we reduced our space by 50% in the process, which I forgot to mention. But I think we wanted to encourage a different way of working. The office wasn't just about sitting at a desk and dealing with emails. It was about coming in and having coffee and sharing time with colleagues. Because if you're also working at home, you've got plenty of time to do emails and reports and video calls, etc. The office is for something different now.
Yeah,
it's an experiment. I don't know. We don't open until the 10th of January with our new office suite, so can't comment.
Okay, right. Sorry, I hadn't understood that it wasn't quite open yet. That's interesting. So you'll be monitoring that quite closely through the start.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Heather, there's a couple of questions that have come up from participants around the kind of notion of sort of self-managed teams in a sense, and managers in a sense their role changing to be more about enabling and kind of providing support. That was a feature that came through in some of the research as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that organizations are going to have to be grappling with quite a lot. I really liked actually one thing that Daisy talked about with regards to job design, and how employers more broadly are going to have to look at how jobs can be designed to be more flexible, whatever that means for that role in that company, in that sector. And I think a similar thing is going to have to happen with management roles as well, how they can be designed to allow them to have the space and the time to fulfill that coaching role, as well as their day-to-day work as well. Because that is something that we heard quite a bit from some managers, was that they don't feel they have enough time in their working day to do all of that, plus get everything else done, to do all of the communication and the coaching and that type of supportiveness that flexible work requires, really.
Yes, and actually that very point links to another question that we've had in around the well-being specifically of managers. And I think it's speaking to that point that actually we're asking an awful lot of managers through this, if they're actually on the front line of this change and this shift and having to respond to colleagues as well as interpret and put into place sort of organisational policies in quite a different environment. Have you done specific things, Steve, around supporting managers in that regard as you're sort of developing this change?
As I say, the manager networks I've created have become the centre of this. So they started out as a training mechanism. Now we've been round the block on a number of subjects. We're kind of revisiting and sharing experiences and working out best practice between us. Because again, I think a lot of this is new and there isn't a rule book for it, and it's different in every organisation. So I think by us coming together monthly, chatting through the challenges and deciding actually that's the best way of dealing with it, and everyone hearing the conversation and the debate allows managers to kind of build on their knowledge and expertise.
Yes, yeah. Another issue that's sort of running through a few of the kind of questions and reflections that you've all made at some point during the discussion so far is the idea that a kind of stigma around flexibility might still exist. And Laura, I wonder whether you might sort of reflect on, the extent to which your research suggests, it's really that stigma which is driving people into a kind of a less healthy or less productive use of devices, and whether in your research you sort of also found or more out about ways in which that might be combated.
Yes, so definitely there is, at the time, there was a stigma around flexibility, but also a stigma around switching off. So what we noticed that was an always on culture that was widespread among different organizations. And that's a very dangerous type of culture. And I probably through the pandemic, these might have been exacerbated by the use of the reliance on technologies and how we might resort as managers to monitor as well our employees through these technologies. So in that sense, the stigma was there, but also the more positive side is that some employees did feel that there was an advantage from this flexibility, and that a workplace where there is a positive culture around being able to switch off is the key for having a positive experience of this flexibility. So definitely it's the work culture and the type of communications within the organization that impact how this flexibility is perceived and the stigma around it.
Yes, yeah. I mean, Daisy mentioned a number of sort of policy implications of all of this earlier and policy considerations. And I suppose another one that is talked more, I think, in Europe, perhaps than necessarily in the UK at the moment, is around a right to disconnect from your work. Is that something, Daisy, which sort of you're sort of picking up that there could be sort of traction on within a UK context, or sort of an appetite for within managers and organisations?
So I think that there is not an appetite for that in Westminster in the UK government. Their approach is much more about nudging and culture change, and so I don't think that's something that they are seriously considering. I know some of the other nations are considering it. We obviously recommended that organizations consider a right to disconnect as part of the recommendations on our research that we did together. I guess as someone who works flexibly myself, I am not 100% sold on the idea, because I often leave work early to pick up my kids. I do work in the evening. I wouldn't be able to work in the way that I do if I couldn't send emails, for example. Although obviously it's incumbent on me to make sure that I don't expect others to respond. And I'm sure that's also where the UK government are coming from in terms of policy. I guess, I'll just come back to this idea of how do you really change the culture so that it's not just a tick box, I work X hours, but it's about quality work and it's about outputs as much as that is possible. Differs a bit in different, you know, sectors, for example, retail, but it's about good work. And I don't, and where we draw the line between stick and carrot, I guess, in that respect. So there is quite a bit of research. The Behavioural Insights team, for example, has done research that shows if you nudge employers to consider whether their job might be flexible in a job advert, it massively increases the number of adverts that are flexible. If you tell everyone in your organization that 20% of men work flexibly, men are more likely to then ask for flexible working. So I think there is something around that. But at the same time, I wonder whether it will be a bit piecemeal until there's something a bit more punchy from government.
Yes.
And I would also just add to the point about, you know, we ask a lot of managers. Yes, we really do. And it's never been, in some respects, a more difficult and challenging time to manage because there's so much you need to consider. And I think a lot of the tools that we need to use now, like coaching, do not come naturally to people. And we would very much argue that these are things that, yes, some people may be inherently better at, but you can absolutely train them. Just to give a sense of the scale. So we recently did some analysis of the labour force survey, and there are about 8.1 million people in the UK, million workers in the UK who have management responsibilities. That's 1 in 4. And we obviously are not the only professional body for managers and leaders, but we have around 60,000 paying members and around 100,000 learners. So there's a massive gap, it seems, between people who are actively managing teams and the training that they are receiving. And I do think that that needs to be fundamental to any approach from a policy perspective as well as from a employer perspective.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Are you sort of, Steve, in the context of your organisation, I suppose, to pick up two of sort of challenges that I guess Daisy has sort of put forward in the course of her reflections, that point around a sort of longer term view on the kind of training and skills that your managers, alongside some of that wellbeing support that you talked about before. And then I suppose secondly, that idea of redesigning job roles and the extent to which you've engaged in some of that or have a view to that in the future.
Yeah, I think firstly for me as an organisation, we're a professional services organisation. So there are a number of people in my organisation that are chartered financial planners or they're members of the Chartered Insurance Institute. And historically, some of the managers were just the long-serving professionals that became managing teams. Over the last 5 years, I've tried very hard to create management as a professional stream within the business in itself. So have become a chartered manager myself, have kind of made it the goal of everyone in the management role to become chartered. So they sit alongside the chartered professionals within the business with equal standing. And with that comes the kind of training and etc. for people to arrive at that. So it's a big cultural shift. And I think 5 years ago, managers didn't have the status that they deserved. And it's hard work to kind of create that status for managers alongside the other professionals in the business. But you have to, I think. Around that's the training issue, and it's a cultural thing, and it needs to be done, and it needs to be role modeled.
Yes.
Sorry, I forgot the second part.
Oh no, not at all. So the second reflection was around sort of role design more generally in the organisation to sort of almost bake in or embed flexibility.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the conversation. We've always had that. If we've had a returner come back after maternity leave into a part-time role, it isn't just the same job. We've almost got to redesign the job because, you know, they're more likely to need work that's project-based rather than immediate client delivery-based. So certainly that's been a consideration in the past, and that's more of the dialogue now that I'm having with the managers around what is this employee looking for, you know, how and what is their work pattern, and therefore what's the best type of work we can give them, whether it's client-facing work or project work or report writing, to suit the hours that they work.
Yeah. That's really helpful. There's been a sort of an additional question in, particularly I think for Daisy and Lara to reflect on, around the extent to which we're seeing organisations use technology to monitor employees, and so rather than the kind of enabling and supportive and coaching kind of approach that we've sort of heard Heather and Steve and sort of others talk about so far, actually using technology more proactively to kind of understand what colleagues are up to at any given point during the day. Laura, I'm conscious your research was sort of from pre-pandemic, but was that a kind of a trend that was happening even before COVID-19, that you would find colleagues or managers in organisations sort of using technology in that way?
I think those that, not so much in the sense that those that would tend to use these technologies in such specific way as a monitoring tool might be those that actually don't trust their workforce. So again, it's a kind of linking back to an issue of trust rather than an issue of the technology being present. So it's about how are we using these technologies. It's linked to how we think of our employees and how we are engaging with them. So we don't need to control or monitor our employees through these technologies if we do trust that at the end of the day they will provide the outputs and the quality of outputs that we're looking for. So it was luckily it was not such a heavy concern or a heavy topic for those that I've engaged with, but I'm not sure what this means now in post-pandemic or in post-pandemic.
I mean, you see and hear in the newspapers of some kind of horror stories around it, where webcams are being used to kind of monitor whether you're at your computer or not, or keystrokes being measured and things like that. Are those the exceptions, Daisy, in your experience? Is that something? So rather than the mainstream?
We actually polled our members about this really recently, and we found that 28%, about 1 in 4, say their organisation does currently monitor staff using technology. And of those, it's about 3 in 5 managers say their organisation monitors office-based staff as well as remote staff. So it's the same proportion, which I think is quite interesting. We don't know whether those people are in specific roles. So if you work for a regulated industry, I believe there are some specific rules around this that it can be important to monitor. But I think I'm not sure that it's necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. But so for example, if you work in an area where you really want to log your hours, and that's important to how you get paid. But if it is a substitute for things like setting clear objectives, being really clear about how your work will be assessed and evaluated, and how you will know that you are achieving, then that's obviously not a good thing. It is a concern if organizations are using that instead of thinking more in a more sophisticated way about what good looks like.
And I mean, if that sort of activity isn't transparent and entirely understood by everyone in the workplace, then it just runs completely counter to that idea of building trust, doesn't it, between colleagues, between different teams, and
totally,
and will have a corrosive impact on culture ultimately.
And I think that kind of that practice of setting clear expectations and having a clear and transparent dialogue with those that you manage is an underrated management skill, and maybe in fact more important when you're working away from the workplace than when you're working face to face and you're less able to get that immediate feedback.
Yes, yeah. I'm sort of conscious of time in the session, and if there are more questions from participants in the webinar, then please do sort of still log them in the Q&A panel. We've worked our way through the kind of vast majority of questions that we had on the list, but there is time for at least another round. So do feel free to contribute further questions. The one which is sort of currently at the top of the list there is around this sort of trade-off, I think, between arriving at a situation where there is sort of clarity and sort of strategic certainty at, I guess, the organisation or the team level around the different flexible options that are available and that are being taken up, versus something which is like really tailored to the individual, and which could then sort of raise perceptions of unfairness if colleagues are working in vastly different ways depending on the kind of individual negotiation between a manager and a colleague. Has that come up, Steve, in practice so far in the conversations that your colleagues are having?
Obviously, the HR department have been very keen to standardise as much as they possibly can, and said 3-2. They're like, great. Well, which days and who and where? And my argument to that is, well, that would be lovely for you, I'm sure, but people have different needs. So there will be people in the organisation who are quite happy to work from home 5 days a week, and others that are 5 days a week in the office, you know. So I'm not being forced into a set of standards because it's convenient for the HR department. And then it's a conversation. It's not a negotiation with your manager. It's reason neutral. Everyone has an option to do it. And if everyone is empowered to have it, no one's in a better situation than anyone else. And it's going to change over time because, I don't know, your parent might become ill and you have to have more care and responsibilities. At that point, you're going to go to your line manager and say, look, can we re-talk about my work arrangements? It has to be on that. It has to be on a dynamic basis.
Yeah. What I am conscious of is through the course of the conversation so far, I mean, we've touched on aspects of this, but you know, in sort of the kind of headlines of the event, you know, we wanted a particular focus on diversity and inclusion, and I suppose one worker group which, you know, faces all sorts of structural inequalities and barriers within the labour market are those with disabilities of different kinds. And Heather, I know in the research that you've led on, that was a particular worker group actually where, you know, there were opportunities and sort of potential to kind of improve matters through an introduction of greater flexibility, but also kind of concerns as well in terms of how that might play out for disabled colleagues. Would you be able to say just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with that, really, it's the recognition that not all disabled workers are the same. It's not one coherent group of people who experience things in the same way and have the same challenges and the same benefits. So of course, what might be great for someone who perhaps has a physical disability, which makes commuting particularly difficult or exhausting or things like that, might be really difficult for someone who has a mental health issue and therefore really struggles with feeling isolated and lonely and that kind of thing. Yeah, so I think that was really the main takeaway we got from that, is that not to sort of treat disabled workers as just this one group that experiences things in the same way.
Yes, yeah, which I suppose again speaks to your point, Steve, around this being a process which needs to kind of reflect and respond to what individuals are bringing to the table in terms of what's going to work best for them.
Exactly, and all the arguments for disabled workers apply in kind of gender and neurodiversity and every other aspect of diversity. So therefore it has to have an individual nature to it, and you know that it's a non-negotiable. I think if we're going to have hybrid working, it has to have flexibility kind of baked into it.
Yes, yeah. One question which came up earlier, Steve, which I'd missed because it was towards the bottom of the list, but was a question around, and I think you referred to sort of commercial decisions that you'd been taken. An insight in terms of what the kind of overall or aggregate impact has been on the bottom line in terms of making some of these shifts. I'm not expecting you to read out a financial statement, but could you, you know, how much of this is sort of required investment? And alongside that, obviously, you'll be seeing efficiencies and sort of cost savings in other areas.
So I'm an SME, so I'm always focusing on the numbers because I can't do. And that there are some things that have been cheaper. You know, I've cut offices. There's less travel going on, so those are cost savings. But I've spent more on management training and mental health programs, etc. So the expenditure balances, I think the business is more productive. I'm definitely seeing an ability for us to deliver a higher level of work with the same size team.
Yeah.
So probably too early to put it into kind of actual percentages, but that my sense is we're delivering more work this year than last with the same size team. Yes,
yeah. I'm going to start looking to kind of draw us to a bit of a close, because I'm really keen that we sort of finish promptly before the event time, so that people will have things to get to. So to kind of before sort of summarising the conversation as a whole, I just wonder whether each of you might sort of provide a bit of a reflection on, as we head into sort of 2022, and we're hopefully heading into a period where, if it hasn't disappeared, then certainly the sort of disruption caused by the pandemic is being ever more minimized and sort of mitigated. What your sort of one reason to be optimistic about this shift to kind of hybrid and flexible working, and one sort of area of concern that you might have that sort of still needs to be addressed. And in a completely arbitrary way, given the order of faces on my screen at least, Daisy, would you be all right to maybe go first?
Sure. So I think it's really a positive that so many people have experienced hybrid working that wouldn't have before. And certainly from a government perspective, they're one of the people that experienced it pretty much for the first time. And they seem genuinely keen to take the lessons learned and embed best practice. I think where I would be concerned is about the potential, without that real focus on management development, the potential for people to miss out, and for that to embed and entrench existing inequalities, which the research shows does not have to be the case. It can be a net benefit. You gave me an easy ride there because I got to go first. Sorry, guys.
This is true. Laura, as it happens, you are next in order on my screen. So in the interest of fairness, I'll turn to you next.
Yes, I think in an optimistic vein, I think this opened up conversations among managers and employees, and looking at the work, for example, that Steve has done with his team, definitely new ways of thinking of how we can communicate within the organization that are not just top-down types of approaches. So on a more pessimistic way, maybe these hybrid forms of work might be considered a temporary fix for the times of the pandemic, and we might not be able to collect the fruits that these experiences have created for different types of employees.
So the idea that we may see through 2022 a bit of a drift back to the status quo over time.
Exactly.
Yeah. Heather, you are next on my screen.
Well, I just sound like I'm totally copying Lara, but I've echoing what she said there about with the top, slightly less focus always on top-down communication in organizations. I think that it's been really interesting to hear a real life example of that actually today, because I've read a lot about this idea of reverse mentoring, and there's lots of other ways that you can open up communication and things to be not so always a top-down approach. That's just one of them, but I haven't really heard so much directly from someone who has been involved in that themselves. And I think that is something that would be a great takeaway, and if other organizations could implement that. And then going forward as well, obviously not just having hybrid generally being a pandemic thing, and that maybe the shifts in mindset that we've had will prevail. I hope so. I like to think they will. But
Thanks, Heather. Steve, finally you, and I suppose it would be great to hear the answer to this question in the context of sort of you and your business, but I suppose also as you look at the sort of world of work more widely, and the world of management more widely as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the great thing is, and without going to a cliche, this opportunity to build back better is a real opportunity. You know, we've had a big jolt in the way that we work, and it's a real opportunity to kind of change and embrace a different way to work. So, you know, when I look back at COVID, I will see it as that jolt that prompted us to change. I think my fear is that businesses might just see moving to hybrid as a kind of once and done thing. Not, it's a long-term experiment that we've got to build and learn on and continue making improvements to. You know, just adjusting employee contracts and saying off you go is not the answer.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more, really. And in sort of the notes that I'd made for the kind of conclusion of this conversation, it was exactly in that spirit, really. And that I think all of you in different ways have, you know, have talked about, and we've heard questions from participants as well, all around trust and around culture and around trying to kind of embed change for the longer term. And I suppose what's always sort of struck me over the last sort of 6 to 12 to 18 months has been just how fast, how rapid some of that change has been. And on one level, as you described it, Steve, you know, in some respects, shifting the technology or shifting a process here or there can be done quite quickly and perhaps surprisingly quickly, based on sort of experiences prior to the pandemic. But embedding that kind of cultural shift, you know, shifting expectations and values and things like that, must be the job of a longer period of time and a kind of really concerted effort and a kind of repetition of effort over and over again, and learning lessons and kind of re-embedding then you know, improvements into the way in which we all we all do those things, supported, as Daisy mentioned at the outset, by the right level of kind of policy change, investment in training in our managers and those on the front line as well. So I mean, I think it's been a fantastic conversation. I hope everybody who's joined us has found it as sort of stimulating and valuable as I have. I'd just like to say a really big thank you to everybody who's attended, to colleagues in the Work Foundation, in particular Heather, but also Rebecca Florison, who's led the work that we've undertaken over the last sort of 12 months, as well as, of course, to Steve, to Laura and to Daisy for their contributions today. At the Work Foundation, we're going to continue to be working on these issues, especially in relation to implications for diversity and inclusion in the workplace. We've got a further project underway at the moment with colleagues at the City Bridge Trust, looking specifically at implications for disabled workers. And we have further work as well coming up early in 2022 around the right to disconnect as well. So please do look out for that. If you would like to get in touch to find out more about the research programme of the Work Foundation or other colleagues across the management school, then please do as well. There'll be more of these events coming in the new year, which is seeking to bring the kind of worlds of academia, policy and practice together. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for some of those as well. But for now, thank you once again. I hope you found the discussion valuable and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.